Greetings, Kate Bishops. Welcome to the Marvelous TV Club, your headquarters for the most insightful and entertaining discussions of the latest episode of Marvel television. Hawkeye has reached a fever pitch with its penultimate episode, and that means there's a ton to talk about. Now, there are a lot of podcasts that talk Marvel TV, but what separates the Marvelous TV Club from the pack is the way we creatively structure our conversations. Last week, Jesse Taylor and I went deep on the characters of the series, which means that this week our Storycast team is here to explore the themes of this epic 5th episode. I am your multi-hyphenate host, producer, editor, social media maven, and more, Marc Faletti, and as always on Storycast, I'm joined by our two story experts.
I'm Amanda Marcotte. I'm a politics writer for Salon.com, and, you know, not quite as good at Twitter as Kate is at archery, but close.
I'd say you're right up there, honestly. And I'm Maeve Adams, Associate Professor of English at Manhattan College and Director of the Digital Arts and Humanities Program.
So wait, Amanda, does that mean your mom gave you a Twitter when you were like 7?
She did give me a journal, so.
Does she regret giving it to you?
Possibly quietly to herself.
The real hard-hitting question I want to ask, though, is about the mac and cheese, because I know you're both like fancy food types and very, educated about all the food things and have great tastes and whatnot. Where do you land on mac and cheese? Maeve, I want to know, is it good? Is it not good?
Mac and cheese is one of the finest foods. It's like, the food of the gods. It's if I had to, be on a desert island with one food, which would probably be total torture. I mean, it would definitely be total torture. Mac and cheese would be up there on the options to consider. And I will say this, boxed mac and cheese is delicious. Fight me.
I won't fight you. In fact,
okay.
This is a take that I keep promising Salon, all right, but keep getting too busy about. I like boxed mac and cheese better than most people's family recipe of mac and cheese. And I eat boxed.
I like it more, but
I eat boxed mac and cheese like Yelena. Like I just take the hot sauce and just pour it over it and just to house it.
Yeah. Yeah, same.
You should get some peas in there too, for what it's worth, for a little healthiness.
I don't know why you want to interrupt the mac and cheese homogeneity with a stupid pea, but
I tend to agree. I kind of like the smooth, pure cheesy creaminess of it all. Well, we do have a few other things to talk about, I guess, besides mac and cheese. Of course, we're going to get into the themes of the episode. We obviously saw a lot of really interesting developments and some great conversations. I was impressed with how much time this episode took to give us some face-to-faces, as Amanda and I were talking about watching it. It was so cool that Kate Bishop and Yelena actually had a full conversation over a meal, not one of those typical TV scenes where somebody sits down, they order something, they yell at each other for 2 minutes, and the person leaves before the food even arrives. And you're like, it's not a dinner scene. We got a lot more than that between the two of them. So that was great. We obviously learned the truth about Eleanor Bishop's involvement, or at least some of the truth of her involvement with what turned out to be the big reveal that the Kingpin is not only behind this, but is part of the MCU and probably has a lot of opinions about Ronin, potentially Clint's wife, potentially Maya, potentially Kazi. All these people might be tied up in some epic Kingpin-related stuff that we're all now going to have to resolve in a finale that's got a lot of work to do. But in this episode, let's start with you, Maeve. I want to know, what did you see as the primary theme or idea that was driving the action and story?
I loved the way that this show had us thinking about family, and particularly the way that all families, whether these are the ones that we make or the ones that we're born into, are all prone to at least a little bit of dysfunction, right? Now, there's obviously a limit to how much dysfunction we sort of want in a family, but the idea that somehow striving for some kind of perfect synchrony between the wills and needs of all these very, very different human beings, that striving for a kind of idealized perfection does more damage than sort of recognizing that different human beings just trying to work it out between themselves are going to, bump up against one another and conflict with one another and struggle to make sense of one another's needs and wills. And the episode in particular, but maybe the show too overall, is really interested in that problem, that question.
Yeah, some of us need to be archers. Some of us need to be criminal kingpins. It's hard.
Correct. I know. Some of us are rich. Some of us aren't.
Some of us hire contract killers to kill the idols of our children. It's all in the mix.
That's parenthood.
Yeah. So, yeah. Well, talk to me about some scenes or maybe a sequence, Maeve, that drove this idea home for you. What made the point that this is what the episode was about?
There's a really touching sequence between Kate and Eleanor, followed by a scene between Kazi and Maya. And they're clearly paralleled scenes, right? The same thing is happening in each scene. Eleanor is cleaning up Kate's wounds. Kazi is cleaning up Maya's wounds. They're both scenes of families that have broken down and that are seeking to kind of repair themselves. And this is kind of literalized through the caretaking, the sort of cleaning of wounds, the curing of wounds. And it's a pattern that this show embodies, this episode embodies, this show embodies, that family, whatever the kind of problems in a particular family, the striving for the provision of refuge, right? That a family should try to sort of offer spaces of repair and refuge, even when they're struggling to kind of make it work. And obviously, Eleanor and Kate are doing this like a boatload better than Maya and Kazi are, because they really kind of come to an understanding with one another, even though, of course, we've got, Eleanor at the end clearly having taken out a hit on Clint. But, I think what's fun about this is that Kate is accepting the care. Like, the problem here is that Maya refuses to accept care from Kazi in the way that Kazi knows he needs to provide it, because he's trying to get her back on a path that will keep her from, being dead.
How does it work, in your opinion, the fact that in both of those scenes, we find out later that all this like love and care between these two individuals in each scene is underpinned by betrayal in both cases?
Yeah, I think one of the things that that I noticed about this episode, and I think this may be just true of Eleanor and Kate's relationship, this particular mother-daughter relationship, is that the betrayal comes from, in that case at least, wanting to control everything, right? To keep her daughter safe. And she says that to Clint, I can't lose her. And I think we can sympathize with that. But the way that she goes about trying to ensure that she doesn't lose her daughter is to try to control the universe. And we all know that we cannot simply try to control the universe for others. It impinges on their freedom and impinges on their free will. And in this case, at least, it's like kind of sort of blown out of kind of metaphorical proportion that she's going to kill the people who are putting her daughter at risk. And so I think the betrayal is framed with respect to this question about family and what it means to kind of manage dysfunction, that if you just try to control everything like some maniac, you're only going to do more damage. You're not, in fact, going to save the person you love. At least I think that's the case for Eleanor and Kate.
That goes to a lot of notes I made about the last episode, which I think was very much about the importance of trust in relationships and letting go. Like, Clint is very controlling of Kate because in some part of him, he doesn't want to get attached. He is so burned from losing Natasha that he just can't allow another person who into his life then he has to respect their autonomy and blah, blah, blah. And yet he's learning, I think, the hard way that you should just let go of control, that none of those things are ever going to be in your control. And it's better just to let people in your lives and offer them a little trust, I think.
And the flip side of that is true also, that, Clint has controlled his own universe by being a lone wolf, but you need to let other people in, because this is a show, and it's an episode, and the episode before this, I think, is also kind of contending with this, that is not certain that the idea of superheroes is a good one.
Yeah.
Right? That there's something dangerous about superheroes. And those lines keep getting crossed when Yelena shows up, and she's kind of super powered, right? She's, trained as an assassin. So where do we draw the lines between good and bad superheroes, good and bad superpowers? I think, for Clint, it's bringing other people into his life that has kept him from totally going off the rails, whether it's his wife or in this case now Kate, who he has to recognize as an equal, those kinds of things.
So if I'm following, Maeve, what you're saying is that the dysfunction that families are prone to is something we have to give space to because it's trying to snuff that out and suffocate it. That Eleanor is certainly trying to do. She even says to Kate again in this episode, I can see exactly basically what's ahead for you, and it's going to be exactly what I want and not what you imagine. That's actually going to be awesome for you. But that's snuffing out Kate's true nature, which, while that does create dysfunction, like broken clock towers and other misadventures and putting her life on the line, her mother's unwillingness to tolerate that dissonance is what is going to rip them apart. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think I would add that this episode, and going back to even the first episode, the idea is not that families are either dysfunctional or not dysfunctional, right? Because Kate's relationship with Eleanor is actually pretty good. And Eleanor does want to make space for her daughter and her daughter's needs and her daughter's will. She just keeps kind of tripping over herself, Eleanor does, in the process of trying to sort of keep Kate safe and manage her own trauma from losing her husband and, all of that. But that's exactly right, Mark. That's exactly what I was going for.
I feel like Eleanor is like kind of a classic helicopter parent of Kate's generation. On one hand, she talks a big game about letting her kid explore themselves and girl power and rah, 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 rah. But in fact, she...
We support all that, by the way.
Yeah,
girl
but
power.
She's never more than 2 inches away trying to keep her exactly on the path she has imagined for her.
Yeah.
Well, and is apparently willing to pay a lot of money to kill people who are threatening that path, right? And who knows what else she's done in the past to keep Kate on whatever this path is for her. It just seems like Eleanor, if she's willing to do this, she's probably been willing to do all kinds of other scary and alarming things. So,
yeah, for sure.
Yikes. But what do you think, Amanda, about this theme? Does it resonate with you? And are there any scenes that you think make sense with this idea?
I think one of the cool things is that Clint and Laura's marriage has been a really joy to kind of watch spool out more in this series. And one of the things that makes them so much fun as a couple to watch is just that they have, between the two of them, really understood what Maeve is saying about accepting that nothing is perfect, accepting that the price of having some of love in your life is that somebody's foibles, flaws, and differences are always going to be there. The conversation between Clint and Laura is laden with all sorts of meaning and possible turns in the plot and all that. But more than that, she says, I trust your judgment and I know what it's like to be you. And basically there's this understanding between them that while Clint's situation is less than ideal, the fact that they just communicate about it and that she gives him space and he gives her space, because they relinquish control over each other. Yeah. I think that they actually end up having a lot more faith in each other. And there's definitely the if you love someone, set them free mentality going on between them. That's a cliche, but it's a good one for a reason, because it's the only way that you can truly be comfortable with somebody is if you feel like they're going to let you be yourself. And that means allowing some amount of quote unquote dysfunction, relinquishing that kind of control.
Yeah, it's a beautiful counterpoint to the kind of bullshit hallmark cliche of two wills becoming one, two people becoming one when they get married, right? It's still two wills. It's still two people. And they really embody that difference and unity with difference, that they're committed to one another and one another's well-being. And what that means is recognizing that they each have things that they need to get done.
It is funny because we do have kind of a country mouse and a city mouse in this show. The country mouse just happens to not be at all, threatened by the fact that the city mouse is in the city doing city things while she's at home on the farm doing presumably farm things.
Farm things.
There's so much
making cookies.
There's so much sexism too in the like way that marriage is idealized as two becoming one, because usually that means a woman submitting her will and her understanding and her like adulthood to a man. And Laura feels like a full-blown grown-ass adult on this show.
Yeah.
And in part because she does not need, her husband doesn't need to hide stuff from her. She doesn't need to be kept in the dark like she's a goddamn child. She is right there with him. They talk about things.
Amanda, I know we're not in the business of speculation here on Storycast, but you shared a theory with me that the Midnight Boys talked about on the Ringerverse podcast that I think might actually bear on this idea of tolerating dysfunction and or each other's quirks, foibles / pasts. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing what that theory could be as far as Laura and Clint and how this might inform their relationship.
All right. Just venturing out beyond what we usually do on Storycast. We usually try to talk about the text as is, but I'm going to speculate based on the Midnight Boys' point that the original Ronin could have been Laura.
What?
And then that makes the fact that Clint is trying to clean up the mess, and that she might have been the one who killed Maya's father, right?
Oh, I want all of this.
And if so, it makes the fact that Clint is in New York trying to clean up this mess even more resonant because it's about him trying to clean up Laura's fucking mess. And the amount of so far she's been the understanding wife who's always understanding him and he's the kind of fuck up. But like, what if both of them have a long past? And the reason that they have an understanding with each other is that they know nobody's perfect because they know each other is not perfect.
Wait, so what was Laura's motivation, right? Like, I feel like we understand what Clint's motivation might be, but what's Laura's motivation?
I mean, she might have been, who knows? They could come up with anything. You could make up a million reasons that she was like killing.
Something about the snap,
Well, she was blipped out. She was snapped out. So.
Right. But before maybe she and Clint met, right? For example, she could have been this Ronin character running around killing people that perhaps the Kingpin, cared about. Because I don't know if we got a date off the top of my head on Maya's father's death.
We did not.
But it could certainly have been the fact that maybe this was before she and Clint met and, their meet cute involved putting her in hiding because everyone wanted her dead. But,
it's recent.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Because Maya was an adult. We know that.
Yeah. Much. She looks like herself.
Yeah, well, and like also herself. Clint and Laura have he must be at least 15. Yeah. So they've been together.
Their oldest son. Yeah.
So they've been together for a while.
Yeah, it's an open question, and obviously that may have nothing to do with it, but if Laura's past is at all connected to this, I just think it ties into that idea of the way they talk to each other involves that understanding of letting your people be who they are and not trying to do that forced, idealized union of wills that you're talking about, Maeve. Yeah. So what are some primary works of literature or film that deal with these ideas of dysfunctional family and maybe the efforts to control them too much?
I was really excited to talk about this because when I was watching last week's episode and I'm watching the scene between Eleanor and Jack and Kate and Clint at the dinner table, and it keeps cutting back and forth between these two shots, right? Like when in film studies they call symmetrical two shots, right? Where two people are in a frame and they're symmetrically organized in that frame. The first thing that came to my mind was this looks like a Wes Anderson movie. And it feels a bit like a Wes Anderson movie because we've got Jack, this kind of like, he's kind of an absurd character. So people are kind of absurdly sort of trying to sort of arrange themselves around this person and deal with this human being. Wes Anderson's films are about dysfunctional families almost exclusively. And there are all kinds of the color saturation is very similar to a Wes Anderson film. The high contrast is very similar. And then in this episode, the bros reference the Royal Tenenbaums. And I'm like, score! I was sitting on the couch at my sister's house because I'm in California. And I was like, yes! And my sister's like, the Royal Tenenbaums? I mean, it's a good movie. And I'm like, no, you don't get it. It just confirms this thing that I knew was there. I knew it was there. And I love this parallel because we think of Wes Anderson as both a sort of comedic director. He builds these really sort of absurd narratives in film. But he offers these really profound messages about family and the dysfunction that comes along with family, and the drive, the desire we all have to resolve dysfunction. Because yes, there are forms of dysfunction that are simply dysfunctional and need to be just excised from your life. And then the forms of dysfunction that just come along with, human beings trying to get along with each other. So I think that to me is a kind of clear comp here, a clear, maybe even something that the, directors and editors are thinking about.
Well, and another comparison between the Tenenbaums and this is that it's also about two families that are super privileged.
Yeah.
And their dysfunction plays out on that baseline of having enormous wealth and privilege.
Well, and also in the context of that, Wes Anderson's films, at the very least, and probably also, I think this show, are suggesting that money doesn't solve all your problems, because these are shows and films, right? This is a show and those are films that really prioritize the misfit, right? Everybody is a misfit in Wes Anderson's films. And part of the problem that we have, we're all misfits here, right? Like, how do we sort of work out our relationship to a world that doesn't acknowledge or recognize the sort of value of the misfit, the genius, right? Or the extremely talented individual? And how do we make space for them? Because misfittery and dysfunction are just aspects of human life. There's just a de rigueur for human life.
One other weird little minor potential visual cue that connects to Royal Tenenbaums, which I hadn't thought about until you were talking about it seriously, is I loved Yelena's coat when she was watching Eleanor walk into the Kingpin. And that is really evocative. That bright brown fur is really evocative of Margot's jacket, which is a really iconic look. That's Gwyneth Paltrow's character in Royal Tenenbaums. And I think even Yelena's makeup is bold in that same sort of way. I wonder if she was supposed to kind of have a Margot Tenenbaum look in that scene.
That's totally brilliant. I think that's right. Because, the other little visual cue we get there is that 3 of the characters in the Royal Tenenbaums wear tracksuits.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
they're red tracksuits.
And those are what the bros are into, which is hilarious. I love that dude on the left, the blonde Russian guy's comic timing kills me. Kills me every time. Amanda, what about you? Primary works that this theme reminds me of. Something really highbrow, please.
Well, I'm really trying to think about Christmas and holiday films and stories. And so I picked the vacation movies, especially Christmas Vacation.
Great. Perfect. Yeah, perfect.
And A Christmas Story, the classic we've all seen a million times on cable syndication. And these are like 2 of the most classic Christmas comedies. I would say probably every Christmas comedy is about dysfunctional families and kind of is on the theme of a bunch of misfits in this crazy family, like your family at home, have some adventures, but they come together in the end because of the Christmas spirit, right? There's kind of a couple of ways to do this movie, and those are probably 2 of the best examples of that movie. And what I love about this is like there's the highbrow kind of more Wes Anderson version of it. And then there's Christmas Vacation with the dead cat.
That movie, honestly, I just want to say this, like, you 2 may not know this, but Christmas Vacation is my favorite Christmas movie of all. It is I watch it every single year. My spouse insists that I watch it when he's not home because he doesn't think it's that funny, but I laugh all the way through that movie. It is hilarious. It's a great movie. Fight me.
No, it's a great movie. The Griswolds are one of the most famous dysfunctional families of American comedy, right?
Yeah.
But they managed to stick together. They managed to stick it out. And also, A Christmas Story, same thing. Like that
very dysfunctional.
Yeah, that's a series of vignettes about a family that is often barely holding itself together.
Yeah.
And obviously the last scene of that movie is like they fuck up the turkey. Yeah. And because Christmas just goes fucking sideways and they end up in this Chinese restaurant having dinner. And yet it's actually kind of beautiful because the whole point of that last scene is like it's in these moments of imperfection. Those will always be the memories. You'll never remember every cookie cutter perfect Christmas, but you will remember the one where you burned the turkey and ended up having dinner at a Chinese restaurant.
Somehow.
Yeah.
You know, the other thing that A Christmas Story shares with Wes Anderson films, shares with this episode and this show broadly, is that it's told from the perspective of youth. So A Christmas Story is told from the perspective of the child, right, who wants the Red Ryder BB gun. And Wes Anderson films are often told from the perspective of the young people who are trying to figure out how to like deal with wacko adults. And this is a show, if we go back to the idea that this is a show, in fact, about Kate, not about Clint as Hawkeye, it's a show told from the perspective of Kate, who is like trying to like figure her way in the world with respect to all these wacko adults who are trying to either protect her or control her or both.
Well, they've been working a lot of good music into this show. Now I know I want the last song on the final credits to be Lindsey Buckingham's Holiday Road from Vacation, which would be an outstanding exit for this
That would
show.
be beautiful.
That would be great. Maeve, what other moments from the series or this episode did you see that tied into our conversation here about dysfunctional family?
Yeah, well, speaking of Kate, one of my other favorite scenes, and I think, you know, this show and this actor are just excellent at comic timing. And many actors in the show are. You were talking about the bro. But Kate really gets the way that dysfunction is a kind of given of families and the people that you love. That moment where she's in her bedroom and she's trying to get Clint on the phone and she just keeps calling and leaving messages. The calls don't go through, but she knows she just has to keep trying until the mailbox fills up, and then she goes to find him. And she saves the day in that moment where Clint is fighting with Maya. But that scene in the bedroom, I think, is really striking because that's also the scene that we start this series in with her father. And she's listening on the fight between her parents. And Kate really understands. She understands the kind of the dysfunction that comes along with loving people and wanting to be part of their world.
Those scenes are usually accompanied by the person who left a bazillion messages feeling really bad and cringing and apologizing afterwards. Kate doesn't give a fuck, man. She's just like, I filled your message box and I would fill it again. Fuck you.
Exactly. She's a real heart on her sleeve character, which I think maybe is also a reason that I really love her, because she's not embarrassed. We're friends / partners. I mean, we're friends, right? That's that scene in the scene between with Kate and Clint and Eleanor and Jack, right? This sort of she's kind of unapologetic and unembarrassed about the things that she cares about and the people that she cares about and how she cares about them.
I do think the other three shows were all just so weary of, or had characters that were weary driving them. And Kate's desire to be what we are here to watch, which is an awesome hero, is just a breath of fresh air.
Kate's also on a journey of learning, I think, from her the kind of on the youth angle. Kate is on a journey that a lot of people are at her age or a little younger, where they realize that their parental figures are human. The day you realize your parents are human. Like, Clint is obviously a stand-in for her father. Like, literally, Clint came into her life the day her father left it, right? And she has used Clint as a replacement father figure since childhood. We were reminded of this in her bedroom, where we see posters of him on the wall and everything. He is the idealized father that she lost. And then her mother obviously is more of a human to her because she's not dead and she's not a superhero. But also the scales fell from her eyes about her mother as well, which is her mother is a criminal. So like, she's learning that Clint is like an imperfect, though good man, right, in her view. But, you know, she's trying to square like her idealization of Clint with things she learned from Yelena about him. And she's also learning about her mother. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing that like movies like A Christmas Story do too, of like kind of walk you through the journey of a young person realizing the people that raised you are not gods. They're just people.
Humans. Yeah.
I think you could argue that this theme was a main theme of the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe during the Avengers breakup, especially. They broke up over the Sokovia Accords and Tony's suffocating pressure to make the team the way he wanted them to be. It wasn't just that they disagreed. It was the extent to which, as you described, Maeve, that the essentially parental figures of Steve and Tony tried to either force everyone to be in total alignment or fuck off and break apart, right? There was no tolerance for some amount of dysfunction around this. And it took all the way until getting back together to deal with Thanos that those wounds were really resolved. I also think the Eternals gets at this idea a little bit as these characters over thousands of years break apart and come together and hold grudges and don't. And the increasing willingness to tolerate each other's foibles and quirks becomes an essential part of that story too.
Shang-Chi also is a story about dysfunctional families. I just watched it finally. Yeah. No, that's great. That's a really interesting observation that this is really something that it's getting at. Yeah.
I got to give a shout out to Pete and Aunt May as we get ready for No Way Home. They also seem like a family that has all these issues resolved where they give each other a wide berth.
Yeah.
Well, before we exit your theme, Maeve, I'm curious if there are other mediums outside of these visual storytelling ones where we get some of this theme of family dysfunction and control.
Yeah, I mean, this is arguably one of the most important themes in 20th century American literature, particularly drama. The problem of dysfunctional families that wants a picture-perfect life, a family that wants a picture-perfect life, and the tragedy that comes from it. It's Death of a Salesman. It's August Osage County. It's Long Day's Journey into Night. It's Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, right? I mean, like, every decade has several of these plays inside of it that are about this very problem, the problem of the dysfunctional family, not wanting to give one another a wide berth, the desire for control, the desire for some kind of idealized utopian thing that's not there and not real. Yeah, it's everywhere.
The funny thing is, like, that's also a common theme in a lot of bad movies and a lot of bad books. And I think that, you know, like a lot of like Hallmark movies will touch on this before they reaffirm the like desirability of the quote unquote perfect family, right? But like, I think that in a sense, like difficult or like common themes are actually more difficult to pull off well because there's so many cliches and so much crap out there that it's nice to see that Hawkeye is managing a very common theme so deftly and so movingly and without necessarily being cliched.
Yeah, it's a hard needle to thread, and they seem to be doing it really effortlessly. I've had a lot of people tell me this has been their favorite Disney Plus show to date from the Marvel universe. And
oh, good.
It's kind of hard to argue with. I mean, Jesse and I talked about that last week on the Character Cast. Just, you know, WandaVision was tough to top because of the moment that it came, but Hawkeye's really, really doing it for me.
Yeah, same.
Amanda, let's turn to you now. Let's talk about a theme that you saw as driving this episode.
So this is very much a redemption story, or I want to kind of expand that out a little bit more. I think because there's kind of classic redemption stories, and then there's stories about how the future isn't written, change is possible, that your past or what other people want from you or nothing is set in stone. You can always choose to be a different person. You can choose change. There's like a freedom into this story. And I think it's a really common holiday story. We'll get to that in a little bit. But like, I think that both Clint and Kate are coming at this from the young person's perspective and the older person's perspective. The older person is a person who feels locked into their past and unable to escape it. And so this is a story of, can they actually be the person they want to be? And then the young person hasn't even had a chance to form into a person. And yet they are being locked into a path by a controlling parent. And the question is, can they break out of the path that's been laid for them and be somebody else? So in both cases, it really is the future is not written. Change is possible.
All right. So the future is not written. Change is possible. Talk to me about a scene or a sequence that drove that idea home. Well,
I think Kate and Clint's stories are so intertwined and aligned that it's hard to separate the two. I think you have this two conversations between two women. First, Kate and her mom. I mean, super important conversation. We've already talked about it. But what really came across to me was that all this language that Eleanor gave her was supposedly affirming and upholding and loving, but actually the subtext is that she's controlling and will not, like, she tells Kate, I can see the road you're on. I can see who you're going to be. And Kate's autonomy is being quietly and in the most passive aggressive way
rerouted.
Erased. And you see a lot of Kate like spending time in her room looking around at all her trophies and stuff and asking herself a really hard question, which is like, my mother like indulged this, but didn't allow it, is clearly not going to allow me to choose this. And what do I do? Like, do I have to do as I'm told? Do I have to fit this role that I've been given, or can I be the person I want to be? And then I think, the same thing with Clint, and he is trying to escape a role that he, for better or for worse, chose, but he doesn't want anymore. And he wants to walk away from, and he wants to have a new future. And the question is, can he be forgiven? And Yelena says to Kate, he can't be forgiven, that change is impossible. So Kate has 2 conversations with 2 women who basically tell her, no, that's not, that who you are is who you are, and you don't get to choose to be a different person tomorrow. And Kate, I think, is walking the journey, and so is Clint, of deciding that that's not true at all.
Yeah. It makes her really sophisticated as a young person, which I'm very much here for. I am tired of TV shows that present young people as idiots. And as this often happens with children in TV shows, that they're just morons. But here we have a young person who is in the process of like working her way through this conundrum, is actually coming to the right understanding that there are ways to change, and we don't have to just obey the sort of writ of somebody else's expectations for us. I mean, Kate's room hasn't changed since she was basically a child.
Yeah.
Right. It's basically the same room. And it sort of lends itself to what you're saying, that her mother has tried for all the right reasons in some ways, right? Like she might be evil, but she's not evil with respect to Kate. She loves her. She wants to do the right thing for her. And in the process is kind of fucking things up, because that's not the way you need to allow a human being to figure out for themselves what they want and follow a path that's right for them.
The Matt Fraction book this is based on is called My Life is a Weapon, and Clint in both last episode and this episode very specifically make reference to that. And what is a weapon but an object to be used? A weapon doesn't have autonomy. A weapon doesn't have a future. And the question is, can he not be a weapon? Can he be a person? And people get to change.
I mean, it's what Kazi is asking for Maya too. Like, don't just be an instrument of your own vengeance. Like, be something more. Give yourself. It's an interesting sort of counter, or not quite a counter, but a parallel to what we're talking about, because Kazi is trying to encourage Maya into a space where she finds a path that is suitable for her, not this one where she's controlled by her rage.
Yeah. Now, of course, we wonder if that's entirely motivated by altruism, or rather Kazi is trying to get her off the path of perhaps discovering that he sold out her beloved father. To your point about the scenes in Kate's room and the conversation with the mom, Amanda, when the mother specifically says, basically, I can see the path ahead, or I can see who you're going to become, basically, she is applying a Band-Aid to the cut, the perfect sort of placement of the Band-Aid. Yeah. And it's such an interesting visual to go with what you're talking about, because, that Band-Aid, it looks like skin, but also not. And it just is kind of this weird, it's this effort to sort of paper over and plaster over who Kate really is. And I feel like that was an intentional choice.
And it's also a direct inversion of the scene from a few episodes earlier where Clint is sealing a wound almost on the same spot on Kate's head. And she put the Band-Aid on like that. But he said, no, that's doing it wrong. You're actually supposed to close it and leave the wound visible. Wow. You're using it to close it. And so that's like an interesting metaphorical language. Like, Clint is about he's teaching Kate to heal and grow.
And Eleanor is just covering shit up. Oh my God, that's amazing. Yeah. Wow, that got way deeper.
I wonder too if Clint is getting some of that from Laura, because Laura's the one, he calls Laura on the phone and he says to her, I'm okay, a little beaten up, but nothing's broken. And what she says in response, she doesn't act terrified or sad or scared. She says, it sounds like you're tired. So there's sort of an understanding that we get wounded, right? And the repair is not something, we can't just fix things for other people, right? We have to kind of let that play out.
So, Maeve, the future is not yet written and change is possible, or so Amanda says. We'll see. Did anything from this episode strike you as fitting that theme?
I really enjoyed that fight scene between Maya and Clint. I mean, I love a fight scene, good choreography, good times. But Maya and Clint in this scene, especially Clint, he kind of goes back to being Ronin, right? He puts on the costume, He's got the sword. And both of them are sort of in their gear that we recognize them in. And they're both fighting in the most recognizably them ways. And yet both of them show a capacity for change. They both pause before they murder. One of the things that I think is interesting about that scene, though, is that Clint seems the most willing to change, the most able to change, where Maya is still very much kind of clouded by her own rage. She sort of leaves in a huff on her motorcycle. But I think that it's important because the two of them are the most driven by anger rather than by, some more abstract sense of justice, maybe.
Yeah, Maya has not left very many scenes not in a huff. I have to say that is her signature move.
She's often mad. Yeah.
She does have a cute mad face. It's hard not to
That's true.
want her to be making mad face.
All right, Amanda, what about some works of literature or film that speak to this theme?
Well, as I said earlier, this is if classic Christmas comedies are about dysfunctional families, classic Christmas dramas are about redemption, salvation, and the fact that change is possible, right? So the most famous, of course, is, and we've talked about it on the show before, but I'm going to bring it around, which is A Christmas Carol. The whole point of that story is that Ebenezer Scrooge is a kind of Ronin-like character, right? Just a miserable person who's just curdled into a hateful person, right?
Yeah.
And he has a chance to be a different person. And then It's a Wonderful Life, of course, which they showed in the last episode.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Is about somebody who believes that his life is over, that there's nothing left to live for. And he's reminded that actually, with community and caring about other people, you can always move forward. There's always hope. There's always the possibility of change. And then there's another Christmas classic that they did the music for on the outro of this episode.
You're a mean one, Mr. Grinch.
That's very good, Mark.
Exactly. Again, these are all the same story over and over again. And there's a reason that I think it's a story that kind of comes back for Christmas, and it goes back to Dickens, right? He was probably the most explicitly Christian of all these people who are telling these stories. But the idea of salvation and redemption is originally a very Christian theme. The idea that if you renounce your sinful ways and you go forward as a generous person, then you can leave your past behind. I'm not a Christian, but I think that there's still a lot of value in that idea. And I think that's why even as Christmas becomes a more secular holiday, we still circle around that narrative because, it's winter, the New Year's coming. I think a lot of us are kind of in the mindset of saying, can we move forward into the future? Do we always have to be weighed down by our pasts?
And how do we sort of manage the fact that we live in a world and are responsible for others in that world, and our redemption is never just our own, or if it is, it's a hollow kind of redemption. And I was thinking about A Christmas Carol also because I think about Dickens a lot, in part because I don't really like Dickens very much. Apologies to those who do. But what I started thinking about when I was thinking about this episode and thinking about A Christmas Carol, as these are both redemption narratives, both narratives where people are trying to make up for lost time, is that A Christmas Carol is a neoliberal fantasy.
Okay.
It is a neoliberal fantasy of a person who can save themselves by staying rich and giving to poor people.
Yeah.
And I realize this is why this novella really drives me up the fucking wall because it doesn't actually ask us to think differently about our communities or the way that we distribute resources, right? It's not like, Ebenezer Scrooge is supposed to come back and like suggest a better distribution of wealth in the British nation state. Oh, no. He just gets to show up at the poor people's party and give them shit and then leave and go back to his fancier place, where he lives, which is not freezing cold and, without figgy pudding. I mean,
you could make the same argument for every superhero story, which is about how hyper-privileged people are the ones to save us all by using their privilege to help us out of jams. The Avengers save people from catastrophes, but they don't like...
Catastrophes they usually create. But
yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. They don't usually like solve poverty. Off screen, I think it's kind of implied that Tony Stark did to a certain extent.
Yeah, and I guess that wouldn't make like a totally exciting movie, Tony Stark redistributing wealth to the world and energy. But I do, and you're exactly right. You're exactly right. It's not like, we're solving the problem of, neoliberalism in this show or in this series or in the MCU. But the I don't know. Maybe it's just because
to defend Dickens, he has other books that are more have a larger critique of society. He just wrote a Christmas novella that was clearly intended to guilt rich people into letting go of some of their money.
Yeah, no, that's right. Although I would say that Dickens doesn't ever argue for a full redistribution. No. And I don't mean like socialism, friends. I just mean like just a better, he makes arguments for, better laws for, protecting the poor and workers' rights. But it's not like he fully critiques the class system. And this show doesn't either. So, whatever.
That's why I think some of the 20th century updates of these stories that are more secular tend to work better. Like It's a Wonderful Life is a story that actually does what you want from that, which is it does argue for redistribution. It does argue for kind of a more socialist view, like bankers are the bad guys. And it is more secular because the problem with kind of the Christian view of redemption is that it doesn't challenge, like this is a long-standing critique of Christianity. It doesn't challenge the powers that be. It just says live with them and try to be a generous, charitable person within them.
And have faith that someday you're going to get yours.
Yeah. And like,
right.
I don't think when you see like The Grinch Who Stole Christmas or It's a Wonderful Life, these are narratives that are taking that kind of that seed and turning it into a little bit more radical of a story. But at the end of the day, stories are about people. They're never going to really be about systems. And I think that the reason that a story like this or any other story that's always going to be about a person's kind of journey to being a better person is like that resonates no matter who you are, no matter what your station in life is. We can all like get up tomorrow and choose to start being a better person.
Yeah. Right.
No, that's true.
We don't need to necessarily restructure the universe in order to be good.
And we can also tell our parents to fuck off with their rules for what they wanted us to be.
That's right. Exactly. We can make a change on our own.
One Christmas story you haven't brought up, though, is everyone's favorite super-powered reindeer, Rudolph. I was thinking about how much, when you were talking, Rudolph's story and Kate's story have some parallels, too, right? Because
sweet.
Rudolph is put in a box, just like Kate, by her mother and told, what he can't be over and over and over again. And sure enough, of course, it's actually his abilities that save the day in the end, which presumably is basically what we're on course for here with Kate. So change is possible, not just in terms of redemption, but in terms of what Kate is looking for too. This idea of becoming what you feel in your heart that you are meant to be or can be.
And that goes back to Maeve's theme, right? Which is the sort of dysfunctional families. A lot of what is dysfunctional about people is also kind of what makes them great. Like,
right.
Kate says something about, the kind of risk-taking behavior and Eleanor's like, that kind of comes with the territory. And that's the point. Yeah, there's no such thing as being a hero without taking risks. There's no such thing as the good without the bad. There's no such thing as being Rudolph without the red nose.
Yeah. You have to be a misfit if you're super anything. You're always going to be outside the norm.
Well, Maeve, you've taught us that Charles Dickens is basically Ayn Rand this episode. What else do you have in terms of works of literature or fiction that tie into Amanda's theme here about the future not being written yet and that change is possible?
So this one is going to sound like it's maybe coming a little out of left field, and maybe it is. But the film Arrival, which is one of my favorite films of the last, decade or whatever, is a film that would seem to be about the opposite, right? So it's about aliens come to Earth. Two scientists get together with, they're sort of ordered by the U.S. military to try to figure out what the aliens want. And the gift of the aliens, spoiler alert, if you want to, go forward and not listen to this, you can. The aliens give them a gift. And the gift is that the language that they teach to these two scientists allows you to know what's going to happen in the future. So in a weird way, right, it's obviously a show about the idea that if we know what will happen, what would we do? And, one of the characters finds out that her daughter will die, and that is devastating. But what I think is interesting about the relationship between a movie like this and what we see in this episode and the show maybe more broadly is that it goes back to Amanda's point a second ago, right? We may not be able to change the systems around us. History may have an inertia that outruns our capacity to make radical change outside of ourselves in terms of how things are going to unfold. But we can change our relationship to those things. And the changing of our relationship to those things could make us a better person, could make us happier, could make us more capable of grappling with tragedy or difficulty or trauma. And I think that there is something about that the small changes, the kind of micro changes inside of ourselves in relationship to others that aren't about trying to do something world changing are as important, if not more important, than any of the other stuff.
It's so important to me that you say this because I think anyone listening to the show is probably quite clear that we all have very lefty politics. But I think that a tendency on the left that's unfortunate is correctly understanding that systems control so much of people's lives gets translated into not thinking about how there's still a value to have within that on the individual taking action, making choices, being better, right? And in part, you almost have to bullshit your way. Like the reason that everyone, right, left, center, whatever, likes superhero stories is because they're about like people choosing to save the day, even in the face of great odds. But also in real life, that's true. A lot of people face daunting odds. And I'm not saying that you're a bad person if you're overwhelmed by them at all. But if we are to change systems, we need people within those systems to say no. And they have to find it in themselves. And that's not arguing for individualism. That's not arguing against communal values. I think it's important to not lose sight of the fact that one of the things we have to do is continually tell ourselves that we have to wake up every day and say, yes, and I am going to change, and I'm going to fight, and I'm going to be a hero. Because if you don't have the MLKs of the world who are willing to like do the thing, systems don't change. Like, and I don't know. That's why I love these kinds of stories, even as corny as they can be.
Well, and also like we don't all have to be, and not all of us will be the MLKs of the world. So it's okay to wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to do my small part to make a change. And maybe it will seem like a change that's just affecting me and my life and my relationship to the, 5 people I love most. But all of those things add up.
Yeah.
If there are enough of me's going around and making a change, showing up at the protests or voting the way that, will save the planet or whatever, these like small changes that we make, they may not save the day, right? They may not change the history of civil rights in the United States.
But if enough of us do it.
Yeah. But we add up We add up to a change. And it matters to wake up every day and decide to do the right thing, even when it's hard, even when it means it puts strain on the relationships around us and that we have with others. But those small things, they add up and they mean something. And those changes that we make mean something, even if they're tiny.
Yeah, I mean, that's why Kant's categorical imperative still has power to this day, right? The idea that if you behave the way that everybody ought to behave, or, if everybody behaved in the way that you behave, that would be a good test of your behavior. Then if you're doing like lots of little good things, that and totally adds up. When you first brought up this arrival thing, though, Maeve, initially I was like, I don't know, because it's like it's this predetermination story. But then I was thinking about Eleanor, and almost every episode has some scene where she reiterates that Kate's not a superhero. But we all know Kate Bishop is a superhero. That is preordained as the death you talked about in the story. And if Eleanor had taken a more positive, accepting relationship with the inevitability that was set in motion over a decade ago, or about a decade ago, I guess, when 2012 happened, then her life and her daughter's life would be completely different, because it's going to happen one way or the other. It's just a question of whether Eleanor is going to be on the right side or the wrong side of it, and how bad things are going to get between them as a result of that.
Well, and there's a similar paradox in Arrival, right? Which is the preordination of her future is determined in no small part by her heroic acceptance of it and her heroic willingness to do the right thing, right?
Yeah.
And so in one sense, it's preordained. In another sense, she chooses it. Like, you can't, it's in classic science fiction, it's a logical paradox, but character-wise, it's inescapable that there's still autonomy within that preordination. And we've talked about this on the show before, like free will is a myth, blah, 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 blah. And yet I think that you can understand that while still also believing that it's important to have autonomy and make good choices.
Yeah, because your decisions matter and you're still responsible for them, even if there's a sort of something behind you pushing you in a particular direction.
So, Amanda, what about some other moments either in this series or in the MCU that tie into the idea that, change is possible?
This isn't just this episode. Natasha's ghost hangs over this entire season, this entire series. And more than any other character in the MCU, she's always represented the kind of Ebenezer Scrooge type, Grinch type, that somebody who was bad that became good. Somebody who we heard over and over throughout all the movies that, the red in her ledger was overwhelming, right? And over again, she would be caught up in this idea that she had been such a terrible person that redemption was not possible. She had killed so many people. In the Black Widow movie, spoilers, she thinks that she killed, and she definitely maimed beyond recognition, a small child, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yet this show positively puts forward the idea that Natasha's sacrifice of her life and her role as a hero and the fact that she chose to be a good person redeemed her.
Yeah.
And there's no other way around it. That's how Clint feels. And Kate is starting to grapple with that too. She's starting to grapple with the fact that Clint had all this red in his ledger, and yet she believes he's a good person. And I think it's not a mistake that they're still grappling with that question and falling on the side of, it doesn't matter how bad you were, as long as today you wake up and decide to do better and make up for it.
Yeah, I mean, that's arguably a theme of the entire MCU TV shows. I mean, Wanda Maximoff begins this story. Loki continues it. That the line between good and evil is really blurry, in part because we can change. We can make a change in ourselves. We can choose to do something different every day and still take responsibility for all of our past choices.
Loki, right? What you just said. I mean, think about it. We have these choices are central to the whole point of that story and the idea that change is possible and redemption for Loki. And he has to stop putting himself through the same dysfunctional cycles and limiting himself to this very narrow conception of who he is based on, through some fault of the people around him, of course, but through Sylvie and his own actions and everything that goes on in that series. I think it's wrestling with a lot of these same ideas. That's really interesting that you're right, that there's a through line all the way back to WandaVision, though. That's very cool.
There's a lot of literalism, I think, in a lot of fan responses to these shows where they're like, Loki killed a lot of people, Clint killed a lot of people. Like, you can't walk that back. And that's probably true in real life. If you kill a lot of people, you got to go to jail for a long, long time. But
this is not real life.
Yeah, these are narrative fiction, and that's the purpose of it.
Yeah.
You in the audience aren't supposed to be like, I also killed a lot of people, but I'm okay. And I don't need to go to jail.
So I'm okay. Everything's going to be fine. Just make a change today.
It's it's exaggerated. It's heightened for artistic reasons. You in the audience are like, I did cheat on my partner that one time. I did betray a friend that one time, but that doesn't mean I am like never going to be a good partner again. I'm never going to be a good friend again. I'm never going to be a good person again.
Right. I mean, and, because another sub theme of this theme you're talking about is the making up for lost time. And Clint is a clear example of that. Maya is an example of that to a lesser extent. But the lesson, I think, of this episode and the show more broadly, and maybe the series, the whole, stable of shows in the MCU, is that if you spend all your time looking backwards, wallowing in grief or wallowing in the past or just stuck in some sort of backwards looking position, then you're never going to look forward to the kinds of things that you could be, the better person you could be, the person that could heal, or the person that could heal others. And I think that yes, you're exactly right. I mean, this is not realism, friends. This is fantasy / sci-fi. We've talked about that on this show. But there is a lesson there about what it means to make a change. And part of it, and the idea that we have to make up for lost time. I mean, we just can't get stuck in that cycle, which is Clint, going to say to Natasha, you're not going to like what I'm doing, but I have to do it anyway. I have to make a change. I can't just sit around thinking about what you would want.
And to defend Charles Dickens.
Please don't.
You mean Mr. Ayn Rand? No.
That's a huge part of A Christmas Carol, right? Is it not?
Fair.
That Scrooge is an old man. He pissed a lot of his life away, but that doesn't mean that he has to piss the rest of his life away.
No, that's right. But that's also the reason that I like the movie Scrooged more than I like A Christmas Carol, because,
Fair.
angel that's constantly beating up, the protagonist in Scrooge is hilarious, and that feels right to me. So I'm going to go with that.
I mean, both It's a Wonderful Life and A Christmas Carol and in Hawkeye, you have that, like, the youthful idealism versus the old cynic who's worried that change is impossible, who's worried that their hopes and dreams for their youth are beyond them, that they can never reclaim that. And It's a Wonderful Life and A Christmas Carol, they actually look back on their youth to sort of remember who they were. And in this case, it's Clint spending time with the youth to remember what that's like and to kind of learn from your youth and to learn from the youth about, living again.
Yeah.
I am tempted to title this episode how Bill Murray ties together all the themes of Hawkeye, because between Scrooged and Royal Tenenbaums, we've got some Bill Murray threads running through this. I do have one last question before we get out of here on this theme, Amanda. Because if there is another main character in this series, it's Maya. Does she tie into your ideas at all here?
Yeah, I mean, it's clear that Maya is on the same journey, and so is Yelena. Like, they are. I mean, the opening scene of the episode is literally about Yelena, like, trying to convert a Black Widow, finding she's already converted, losing 5 years.
Yeah.
And coming back and having multiple conversations with the same woman. She sees her at one point in her life. She sees her 5 years later. And coming to this kind of realization, being told by her friend that moving forward is possible. And then, Clint tells the same to Maya, right? He has her on the ground and he says, you can't just let yourself be a weapon. You have to be a human, right? Functionally. And as mad as she is at him, as much as she walks off in a huff, you can tell that it got to her. And I think that we all know she's going to have her own show, et cetera, et cetera. But like,
I can't wait.
It's clear that they're setting her up on the same kind of journey. She's actually got a lot in common with Kate, right? Her father, for better, for worse, put her on the path to be a gangster. And maybe he loved her just like Kate's mom loves her.
Yeah.
But he also put her in a box and she has to get out of that box.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about her relationship to her father that way.
No, me either.
Yeah. That's smart. Yeah.
Well, you guys have done it again. Tons of brilliant insights. I can't wait to keep thinking about all of this as we prepare for the final episode. Jesse and Christine and I will be here to talk about all of that. We are going to go way into all kinds of big ideas about these characters on our Character Cast next week. But, Maeve, if people want to talk to you more about the themes of this episode or series, where can they find and follow you?
You can find and follow me on Twitter at Maeve Adams.
And Amanda, what about you? Where can people come and talk to you about Hawkeye?
You can talk to me on twitter.com about Hawkeye. I'm at Amanda Marcotte. And you can also read me write about politics at salon.com.
All right, Killer Kingpins, that is our show for today. We will be back next week, like I said, so look for the Character Cast to wrap up an incredible series and our first year of the Marvelous TV Club. If you're enjoying this show, please leave us that 5-star review because that makes us rise in the search rankings. It would mean so much to us. And if you want to talk to me some more, you can find me at the Marvelous TV Club Facebook page, Instagram page, Twitter page, and of course my own Twitter at Marc Faletti. That's Marc with a C. Until next time, gang, let's start dressing in tracksuits. Oh, wait, I already did.
And if you had Zoom, you could see him.